Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today, I'm very pleased to have Emma Tekstra back with us again. Emma is a global health consultant and independent health researcher, passionate about helping companies and individuals understand what truly creates health and well-being. As a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries, Emma is deeply rooted in the data and science of the human body and what makes it tick or break down. She's the author of How to Be a Healthy Human. Welcome, Emma. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today I want to ask you about somebody else's book. It's kind of weird, but so the book is Turtles All the Way Down. I learned about this from your book, and that's why I went and read it, and it totally blew my mind. So the reason I'm interviewing you about their book is because it was written by anonymous authors, which I assume the reason for that is fairly obvious, but what's your take on why they didn't want their names to be out there?
Yeah, so part of the problem with this kind of information about vaccines or any other aspects of the conventional medical industry is that those who don't want it to be common knowledge go after the individuals with personal attacks instead of focusing on the arguments that they're making. So the book was written by doctors in Israel. It was actually originally written in Hebrew, and it's been
Yeah.
translated. And Israel's a really small country. So part of their reason for remaining anonymous is just to protect their families, and everybody kind of knows each other. But it also makes sure that any criticism of the book is focused on the science and the evidence that they're bringing. And there's a lot of it. There's a whole separate
Yeah.
reference document that you can go into with links to all of the papers and things like that. So actually, so much silence followed once they published the book that an academic actually decided to offer a reward of 4,000 US dollars if anybody could dispute any of the arguments made in the book or even the claims made at the end of the first chapter. And to date, there's just been total silence. Nobody's been able to do it.
Wow, I hadn't heard that. That's fascinating. Yeah, and part of the reason why I really wanted to bring this up is because I am a naturopathic doctor and I didn't know this stuff. Like they didn't teach us this in school. So it totally blows my mind. And just like we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty in the rest of the conversation, but the book isn't really going into the like this vaccine causes this side effect. It's taking a big step back and it's looking at the bigger picture of what's really going on behind the scenes in terms of like the vaccine industry and a lot of the sleight of hand that goes on in terms of interpreting the data. So first thing I want to ask you about is the book states the three pillars of vaccine safety are pre-licensure clinical trials, adverse event reporting systems, and post-marketing epidemiologic studies. So can you explain, first of all, for our audience, what these are and why
Sure.
they're important?
Sure. So the main arguments for and against vaccines, right, are about their safety. So
Right.
whether the harms outweigh the benefits, and their efficacy, whether they do what they say they're going to do.
Right.
Safety is most critical because unlike other medical products, you're giving vaccines to people who don't currently, they're not sick, right? At least not
Right.
with the infectious disease that they're actually designed to
Right.
combat. So
Sure.
they may have different health problem, of course, but so many vaccines are given to perfectly healthy babies.
Right.
So the pre-licensing clinical trials are what you tend to hear most about. So once a new medical product is developed, in this case a vaccine, the manufacturer carries out clinical trials to show the government authorities that they're safe and effective so that they can approve them for use. So they start with animal trials in phase 1, and if that looks okay, then they'll give the vaccine to just like a few hundred people in the phase 2 trial. Just there won't be any control group. We'll get into that. Just a few people to see if it's sort of safe. And then if phase 2 looks okay, then they'll get into those all important phase 3 trials, which is what approval is based on. So phase 3 usually involves a few thousand people and compares the trial group, those receiving the vaccine, with the control group, those who don't, and then they compare the outcome. But clinical trials are really limited in their scope. So for example, if a trial includes 5,000 people, they might miss a reaction that statistically occurs in one in, say, every 6,000 people. So if you think of all the millions of people that are getting vaccines, that could be a problem. So the trials also just tend to focus on certain groups. So maybe healthy individuals in a certain demographics.
Right.
So the trials won't show any problems that might occur in broader demographics or people with existing health problems. So because of that, we we need these other two pillars that you mentioned. So the adverse events reporting system, so that's set up by health authorities. And it's
Mhm.
essentially a huge database. So after a vaccine is out in the market being administered to millions of people, a doctor is expected to make a report if anybody's reacted badly, for example. And then the third pillar is those post-marketing epidemiological studies. So epidemiology studies disease at the population level rather than the individual level. So it's
Mhm.
carried out by scientists and actuaries like me.
Mhm.
I actually considered becoming an epidemiologist once I was qualified as an actuary in my 20s. I
Yeah.
found it really, really fascinating. But if you look at the various health-related data points and all the different demographics, in this case, those who got a vaccine, got sick, or got the disease, or had problems or not, and then it draws conclusions through the statistical relevance because there's so much data. There's now millions of data points. So that's
Mhm.
basically we can get more into that later.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So back to the trials themselves. So at that earlier level, you're supposed to have placebos that are involved in all of this, right? So the placebo controls were told that all of the vaccines that are on the childhood schedule had a placebo control, but that isn't actually true. Why do they claim that they have been, and why haven't they? What's going on there?
Right, right.
Yeah.
So if you think about the clinical trials, if something happens right away
Yeah.
within hours of the vaccine, like a fever or a sore arm, you can
Sure.
easily attribute it to the vaccine. But if
Right.
it's days or weeks later, it becomes more complicated to attribute it to the vaccine or something else that happened to be going on. So
Sure.
that's why in the phase 3 trials, they're supposed to have these placebo controls. So
Yeah.
half of the people get the vaccine being tested and
Mhm.
half of them do not. And then
Right.
you can use statistics to analyze the outcomes, good or bad, that is from the vaccine itself. So
Yeah.
let's say that there's a trial and there's 1,000 children. So
Mhm.
let's say 500 get the vaccine and 500 don't. So in the vaccine group, let's say 50 of them have a high fever over the next week or something, and then in the no vaccine group, let's say, or the supposed control group, let's say only 10 have a fever in the next week, and it could be that they caught a cold or some other kind of
Sure.
virus, that
Right.
just happened, just kind of a coincidence. It happened at the same time. So this
Right.
all sounds really good, right? So the
Yeah.
problem is what is being used for those placebo controls,
Exactly.
as you mentioned. So
Yeah.
ideally, it would be nothing but a saline solution, which is completely inert in the human body.
Right.
But sadly, that's not the case. Vaccines are actually mostly tested against other vaccines as the control. That's
Yeah.
what's so crazy. And sometimes they will test it against a shot that includes all the vaccine ingredients, but not the antigen. So that's the specific antigen for the disease. But the
Right.
ingredients, the other ingredients include things like preservatives, like formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen,
Yeah.
stabilizers, and the all important adjuvant.
Mhm.
So I think it's important to mention the adjuvant. So this is a known toxin, something
Right.
like aluminium or mercury, so aluminum. Sorry, you
Sure.
might get
Yeah.
the British
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
British
Here we
words are
go.
popping out of me. um, so that gets the immune system really hyped up to respond to the antigen. That's the virus or the bacteria that the vaccine is meant to be protecting against. So it's essentially tricking the immune system into creating antibodies.
Yeah.
So in fact, these adjuvants are toxic by design. That's what
Right.
they're to be doing.
Sure.
And most of the adverse reactions to a vaccine, it's due to these extra ingredients and not the dead or weakened virus or bacteria that's being addressed.
Right.
So to give you an example,
Mhm.
so if we look at a particular vaccine and what the control was, so DTaP, let's look at DTaP.
Okay.
So this is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, whooping
Uh-huh.
cough.
Yeah.
And this replaced the old DTP
Mhm.
vaccine. And that really, they brought out a new one because the old DTP was known to cause serious side effects.
Right.
So, but the control in the new clinical trial for DTaP,
Mhm.
everybody was given the control was given the old DTP vaccine. And so there was no true placebo. Now, if you look back to, okay, well, what's the old DTP vaccine?
Right.
So that was developed in the 1940s. So old, and they never had all of this methodology. So there was no control group at all, and
Right.
no methodology for tracking any side effects or anything. But it was known that it caused a lot of side effects in recent years, which is why they use this new one, or developed this new one.
Yeah.
And what they found in this new clinical trial was 1 out of every 22 infants in this new trial were hospitalized from the DTaP vaccine, but they didn't think it was a concern because it was similar to the control group,
Mm.
right? But the control group was the old DTP vaccine. So
Sure.
just to I'll give you an example of using just the vaccine ingredients.
Yeah.
So Merck's hepatitis A vaccine, the
Yeah.
package says it was tested against a placebo. It uses the word placebo. But
Right.
on investigation, if you investigate what that placebo was, they get a shot without the antigen, but it had aluminium in it in the shot, as well as the preservative thimerosal. Thimerosal is based on mercury, and
Right.
there's plenty of science now that shows those two toxins together become exponentially more neurotoxic than either one of them alone. Yeah, it's really crazy. And the book authors actually do a really wonderful job. They list out every single vaccine on the childhood schedule now,
Yeah.
and who the manufacturer was. Sometimes a vaccine has two different manufacturers, so who the manufacturer was, and what the clinical trial was, what the placebo was. In some cases, there's no control at all, and
Right.
they tabulate this all out. And so the implications for this revelation really can't be overstated enough,
No.
because from a scientific perspective, there's zero evidence that any of the vaccines on the childhood schedule have been really tested, fully tested for safety, i.e., causing more harm than they prevent.
Yeah, and what you just described is where they get their title from. This idea of, so this was compared to this, which didn't have a control either, which was compared to this, which didn't. So it's turtles all the way down. So
Exactly.
they tell that story. So I think that this was also referenced, I want to say at the beginning of a Stephen Hawking book, where there was a woman who said that the earth is resting on the back of a turtle. And
Yeah.
they said, oh, and the speaker thought, I'm going to get you. What's the turtle on? And she says, another turtle. And then he says, what's that turtle on? And she goes, you think you're so clever. It's turtles all the way down. So that was
Yeah.
the
It's a
reference.
wonderful title.
It
Yeah.
is a wonderful title. And so it's
Yeah.
so, yeah, super clever. And that in and of itself, if it was just that chapter, that's absolutely shocking, like the implications of that. So none of them have been tested against a true placebo, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. So I'll get to the why in a
Okay.
little bit on that one. But so let's talk about as far as kind of is there a causal link, like some of the post marketing once it's out? The Institute of Medicine. So this was a committee that was tasked with determining whether or not there was a causal link between childhood vaccines and any adverse events. So who are they? Why were they chosen for this? And what did they base their conclusions upon?
Yeah. So the Institute of Medicine, it's actually now called the National Academy of Medicine, but we'll stick to IOM, as that's what it was called when it was originally tasked with the vaccine question like 20 years ago. So
Right.
it's part of the broader National Academy of Sciences, and that organization is meant to be an independent body serving in an advisory capacity to the nation, to policymakers, to the public,
Yeah.
and obviously in IOM's case on medical and health matters. So they've published a number of reports over the last 20 years on vaccine safety, but the one that gets all the attention nowadays is a 2013 study on the safety of the whole US national vaccine program, and it basically concluded nothing to see here, all is well.
Interesting. So, and their conclusion was based on what exactly? Like, how did they come
Well,
up with that?
yeah, so they spent 2 years looking at all the epidemiological evidence, right? So all the statistical data, the clinical trial data, as well as any biological evidence. So medical studies in humans on any adverse reactions or anything. And they
Mhm.
focused on 158 adverse events or conditions. So Guillain-Barré, vasculitis, juvenile diabetes, autism, asthma. These are all conditions that they studied. And they
Right.
found a causal link in only 14, and I think a suggested link in just another 4. And for the rest, it concluded that the evidence was insufficient to
Mm.
either prove or refute a causal link. So
Right.
the government and the media blasted that this meant oh, vaccines are safe.
Right.
There's no evidence for most of these adverse health conditions
Right.
being due to vaccines. But
Right.
the absence of evidence is not evidence of
Right.
absence, right?
Right.
So, in other words, just because they couldn't find any evidence, that doesn't mean that evidence doesn't exist.
Sure.
So, actually, this study presents the glaring problem with the conclusions in that particular report that they should have sounded alarm bells, that there's a massive lack of scientific research into the effect of vaccine ingredients on the body,
Mhm.
the biochemical interactions between different vaccine ingredients,
Mhm.
the between different vaccines that are administered within weeks or months of each other, let alone on the same day. There's never been any of that research.
Right.
What genetic characteristics or familial traits can leave individuals more susceptible to adverse events, any existing health conditions that might possibly lead to worse outcomes.
Mhm.
Long lists, but the problem is that vaccine research is radioactive.
Mhm.
Nobody wants to touch
Right.
it.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
if we don't study what's causing these adverse events, we can't hope to make vaccines safer or know how to help people that have already been harmed.
Sure. So to clarify here, so it's sounding like what you're saying is that the question that they are supposed to investigate is correlation versus causation. Is there a correlation between this vaccine and these symptoms that is completely unrelated, or is the vaccine causing it? But in order to answer that second question, you have to understand like what's the potential mechanism for how this ingredient could cause adverse effects. And if you
Exactly.
don't look for what the possible mechanism could be, you can't expect to find it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Basically. So
yeah,
and if
yeah,
nobody's
yeah.
looking,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, nobody officially commissioned by the government,
by
right,
the
has been looking
government is looking.
into the
Sure.
vaccine ingredients. But
Right.
there is some science being done.
Right.
Some of it's not published. Like in the early 2000s, the US government realized how much mercury babies were getting in their first 2 years of life. Mercury is a known neurotoxin, as we mentioned.
Right. Right.
And they quietly made a push to get mercury out of vaccines with, just very quietly, didn't
Mhm.
appear in the media or anything.
Right.
And then other independent scientists are looking at some of the other ingredients. So Dr. Karl Jablonowski over at Children's Health Defense, that's the
Right.
organization founded by
Mhm.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.,
Right.
Dr. Christina Parks, Dr. James Lyons Weiler. So they've looked at things like now the amount of aluminium a 1-year-old is subject to across those first 12 months if the CDC schedule is adhered to.
Mhm.
Aluminium's been shown to build up in the brain, and it's difficult to detox. So it may be the cumulative effect that's the problem. But
Mhm.
remember, at the time the IOM report came out in like 2012, 2013, the
Mhm.
commission claimed there was insufficient evidence, and rather than sound the alarm that more studies need to be done right away, and
Yeah.
that safety couldn't possibly be claimed because of the lack of scientific evidence, they just highlighted the lack of findings. And
Uh,
then epidemiological studies that focus on the statistical data, they're actually insufficient without the evidence of the mechanism of harm. So statistical data is only ever an approximation to
sure.
what's really going on. There needs to be a published biological explanation. So it's really important to do the medical studies in a lab, but who's going to fund those studies?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. So, and then into the whole idea of reporting systems. So, VAERS, I had never even heard of VAERS until the COVID vaccine
Doesn't
and all of
surprise me.
that stuff
Right?
happened. But so, what is it? What is its theoretical purpose before I get into some more of that?
Yeah, yeah. So VAERS stands for Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. So
Okay,
it's the US version of that database that health authorities supposedly track problems with any vaccines once they're out in the market.
got
So
it.
that's that second pillar of safety that we talked about earlier. So each country has their own system. The UK has the yellow card system, for example, and they all work similarly. So
Okay,
VAERS in the US was started in 1990. It was part of those new regulations that were passed in 1986 to
mhm,
grant immunity to the pharmaceutical companies from liability for vaccine products. So
got it.
that marked the 1986 marked the start of the vastly expanded vaccine schedule, and VAERS started in 1990.
Yeah.
Now anybody can submit a report on VAERS. Vaccine manufacturers are technically required to, if they become aware of any adverse effects, but then doctors or members of the general public can do so as well. And
Mhm.
just to give a sense, right? So before COVID, when like you heard of it and everybody started hearing about it,
Right,
there
yeah.
was something like 20 to 30,000 reports made on VAERS every year.
Mm.
There was actually a first big uptake when the Gardasil, the HPV
Yep.
vaccine, was rolled out in 2009, and that was a really terrible vaccine. Even in the clinical trials, 1 in 43 young women were diagnosed with an autoimmune disease shortly after getting the vaccine.
Yeah,
So really horrible. So there was a big uptake then, but then VAERS really exploded with the rollout of the COVID shots in
sure.
2021, and there was
Yeah,
very quickly like 1 million reports. So just to
right.
give you a sense of the numbers. So theoretically, a system like theirs should alert us to any problems with individual vaccines, specific batches of vaccines, even
Mhm.
enabling us to track any risk factors for adverse events, and really to monitor the risk profile of the vaccines.
Yeah, but the fact that it's voluntary. So, I mean, to the point where I'm a doctor, I'd seen plenty of vaccine injuries and I didn't even know to report them because I didn't know that this existed.
Yeah.
So, how does that call into question the significance of the findings that are
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a passive system, so
Sure.
nobody approaches doctors and reminds them to use it. So
Right.
yeah, if you ask a bunch of doctors and
Right.
nurses, they probably like you don't have never
Yeah.
even heard of it, let
Right.
alone how to go about making a report.
Right.
So a single entry, even if you did know, a single entry probably takes about an hour. To put all the entry in with all the information, and
Right.
that's if you're familiar with all the screens and everything. And doctors aren't getting paid for that time,
Sure. Yeah.
and parents are even less aware of such a
Sure.
system.
Right.
But various analyses now have actually assessed that it's actually underreporting the true case of vaccine industry injuries.
Right.
So these assessments think the underreporting is anywhere from 1 to 10%.
Mm.
So just to give you a sense of what that might mean. So let's say a vaccine is administered to 4 million babies in a year. And let's say in VAERS, there's 100 reports of a particular adverse event, let's say seizures. So 100 out of 4 million babies would indicate the rate of seizures is 1 in 40,000. And you could legitimately say that that's a rare reaction, right?
Right.
So, but if VAERS is underreporting, so let's say only 10% of the actual reactions are reported,
Mm.
then those 100 reports actually represents 1,000 cases. So now the reaction rate is 1 in 4,000 babies. But
Right.
if the underreporting is nearer 1%, which is what is generally agreed these days with all the analysis that's been done, so
Right.
those 100 reports actually represent 10,000 cases of seizures, and now the rate of seizures is 1 in 400 babies. So
Wow.
now that's a major concern.
Sure, yeah. So orders of magnitude different
Yeah.
in terms of what's going on there. Okay, so is you said that the manufacturers are required to list any kind of adverse effects here. So how useful are those reports typically when they are required to make them?
Yeah, so technically only the manufacturers required,
Right,
so
right.
they tend to be the majority of the reports, but there's little to incentivize the manufacturers to make fully and complete reports. So for example, in the case of the Gardasil vaccine that I mentioned earlier, when
Mm.
it was rolled out, there was immediately a lot of anecdotal stories about teenagers exhibiting serious illnesses and neurological problems after the vaccine. So in 2009, the CDC said, oh, we're going to initiate a study of theirs and see if there's a problem, right? And so
Mhm.
they found that 2/3 of the reports had been made by Merck, the manufacturer, but over 90% of those reports had insufficient detail to warrant inclusion in the study, so they simply threw out the reports. Yeah,
Wow.
so the poor quality of the reports plus that underreporting that we mentioned
Sure.
makes it a really dubious system to monitor safety.
Well, yeah. So then there's also the vaccine safety data link. What is that, and is it theoretically any more reliable?
Well, this is the VSD is a CDC run
Okay.
information network, and
Okay.
so it pulls data from U.S. healthcare systems that have agreed to share their data. So if you think of electronic medical records, so
Right.
when you visit a doctor or a clinic or a hospital and you get a test or a procedure or you fill a prescription out, the all that data, each of those is an individual data point which links back to you as an individual. So
Mhm.
data scientists and actuaries can then study this data, usually for financial management reasons, right? Because they can monitor care as well, but
Yeah.
it's mainly financial. And then the systems have agreed to share the data with VSD, but it's wholly under control of the CDC.
Mhm.
So it's not available to the general public, and no researcher can just say, oh, I'm going to make a study on it. You have to submit a formal request and
Mhm.
say, what you're going to study and
Right.
who's funding your study and what you're going to do with
Sure.
it. But so
Right.
the CDC keep a tight rein on this particular database and how it's used. So theoretically, it's probably more reliable because it's a simple tracking procedure, and every
Right.
test and medication that's given, because it's for financial reasons. So there's no, the main objective is not to track adverse events. So if somebody needs to get paid for that particular procedure, they want to make sure that the data is input correctly.
Mhm.
So, in theory, a statistical analysis can analyze if you had that vaccine and then what tests and procedures and medication you had after it.
Mhm.
It might indicate a particular illness or something, and
Right.
then they can see the conditions that might indicate.
Mhm.
But, as researchers can't get access to it, it's kind of a moot point.
Got it. Yeah. And so every now and then some concerns leak out into the public. And the one that I'd heard about, I think the only one that I'd heard about for a number of years was the MMR controversy from the 1990s. And it was associated with Dr. Andrew Wakefield. So tell us a little bit about that story. What was going on there?
Yeah, so the Dr. Wakefield controversy had actually a really big impact on my life and
Really?
career, because he's British and he had to leave the UK around the same time that I moved to the US, and
Right.
I was a newly qualified actuary at the time. I already had a weird fascination with autism, so I really kind of followed it quite closely. So
Yeah.
I'll try to summarize it, but it's quite a long story, so bear with me, because I
Yeah.
think it's important to address this one fully, because there's so much bad information out there.
Right.
But basically, Dr. Wakefield is the first to raise the issue that vaccines could possibly cause or at least contribute to autism, and
Mhm.
it ruined his career. So other doctors now call it Wakefielded if they get censored or maligned for simply doing their job.
Oh, wow.
So MMR is the triple header vaccine: measles, mumps, and rubella, also called German measles, and it
Okay.
was originally licensed in 1971.
Mhm.
So Dr. Wakefield graduated in 1985, and he was a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in the UK.
Mhm.
He specialized in gastrointestinal surgery, so nothing to do with
Oh,
neurology.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, he's highly acclaimed in his field. He'd
Yeah.
already published over 140 scientific papers. Yeah,
Wow.
he worked out of the Royal Free Hospital in London, which is a huge, very well known teaching hospital.
Right.
He became an expert in inflammatory bowel disease.
Mhm.
And so one day, he's reading his journal and he comes across this study of four mothers who, when they were pregnant, they contracted measles, and three of the four resulting children were diagnosed with very severe Crohn's disease.
Hmm.
And so 3 out of 4 having that very specific disease is nearly statistically impossible to just be coincidence, right?
Right.
So he ends up publishing a paper in the Lancet, the prestigious medical journal in the UK. This was around 1994, and his study was called, is measles vaccine a risk factor for inflammatory bowel disease? Okay, so no problem so far. But
Mhm.
because he published that first paper, parents start reaching out to him who believe that the MMR vaccine caused gastrointestinal disease and neurological regression in their children.
Oh, hold on. Let me clarify something. So you
Okay.
mentioned that they'd had measles during their pregnancy. You meant they got the MMR?
That's they were looking at that. So the journal article
Right.
said that they got measles, and so
Oh,
then he dug into, did they naturally contract measles, or
okay.
did they have the vaccine? So yes, that
Ah,
was
okay.
the absolutely, I mean, that's the whole,
Okay.
that was the
Okay.
implication, but it
Yeah.
wasn't that clear. So it was just kind of an exploratory paper. Hey, we're not that sure because the records weren't that great, but
Right.
let's look into this. Let's have more investigation, which is
Sure.
what, a lot of these fantastic doctors are doing. They're just kind of saying, hey, let's just, this just warrants more investigation.
Sure. Yeah.
So, so he'd done that. So, but then parents start saying, "Oh, I think my kid regressed or had all these problems after MMR." And of
Uh,
course, they do research online, and they came across Dr. Wakefield, and then
yeah.
oh, he might know something about this. So
Yeah.
they reach out to Dr. Wakefield. So
I,
this is sort of building up, and he starts looking into some of this, and just kind of starts getting interested, right? So then eventually a lawyer contacts him. So now it's around 1997, and
mhm.
this lawyer was actually representing parents of 12 children that they were actually wanting to sue Merck for saying that the MMR vaccine actually caused autism
Oh,
and gastrointestinal problems in their kids. And the
okay.
lawyer was just looking for a medical expert to testify whether this was possible or not.
Right.
So Dr. Wakefield gets involved very reluctantly, but gets
Right.
involved. And through that whole study and analysis of the children, and he pulled in a whole bunch of colleagues.
Yeah.
And then again, he wrote up another paper for the Lancet, as he'd done so many times before.
Sure.
He
Yeah.
writes a paper for the Lancet. He was the lead author. There was 12 other authors who were very involved in the study. He didn't even examine the children. All his colleagues at the Royal Free examined these children. And so
Mhm.
they write up this paper. It was completely observational,
Mhm.
and the conclusions really just called for more research.
Mhm.
And then made a little suggestion that the parents maybe not have the combined MMR, but have the individual vaccines for each of them separately. That
Right.
used to be available back in those days, and then they were
Okay.
taken off the market, so you had to have the MMR.
Right.
But anyway, so that whole paper, very sort of innocent paper, sent shockwaves through the medical community.
Oh,
And the mainstream media got hold of it, and they published a hit piece on Dr. Wakefield. They were claiming ethical misconduct. It was totally unfounded, but he was let go from the Royal Free Hospital in the UK, and he ended up having to leave the UK. And he's been in the UK, been in the US ever since.
wow.
But God works in mysterious ways, and he's ended up becoming this phenomenal filmmaker.
Oh, really?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, you should look
Oh,
up his movies. So I think one of his first was called Vaxxed, and this was about a CDC whistleblower that
uh-huh.
spoke up about some of these dodgy things that have been going on at the CDC.
Wow.
Another one called 1986, The Act, which was about that act
Right.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
took away liability from the pharmaceutical companies. And then his latest actually just came out this year, and it's called Protocol 7.
Uh-huh.
And this one is another whistleblower, this time from Merck internally,
Uh-huh.
and about the measles vaccine itself.
Wow.
So, I get really mad when I hear people dismiss this dedicated doctor who's just trying to help children, and they
Sure.
say he's a crackpot or a fraudster. And,
Right.
it's now become norm to go after individuals, as we said, in these
Right.
ad hominem attacks, which is why part of the reasons why the Turtles authors chose to stay anonymous.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So, some of the scientists on the other side who are arguing for vaccines will point to a lot of studies that fall under the category of retrospective observational studies. So, as opposed to double-blind placebo-controlled. Why is
Right.
that important?
Right, right. So the randomized control trials that we previously discussed as that first peer, right? They're really
Sure.
expensive to carry
Right.
out.
Yeah.
And if they're done properly with a proper placebo control group, they're kind of hard to manipulate because
Cute.
the
Yeah.
groups are blinded from the start.
Right.
And they're only based on a few thousand people.
Mhm.
So the third pillar looks at these retrospective observational studies. They're much cheaper and easier to do.
Right.
And this is epidemiology, that study of disease in broad populations, as we talked about. So they're taking existing health data from these health systems, for example, and they're looking at what happens in these different groups. So with the growing noise from parents since the Wakefield controversy, the governments and pharmaceutical companies felt that they needed to beef up the narrative a little bit on the supposed safety
Mhm.
of vaccines. So these large scale studies, they're really useful for doing that because well, from our perspective, that the problem is that they're really easy to manipulate,
Mm.
right? So they can decide how to allocate the research subjects into one group or another.
Okay.
And then if the results don't give the outcomes that they want, they can actually change the
Shuffle it.
groups. Yeah,
Oh,
right. And then rerun the analysis, and they can omit certain data or subjects for arbitrary reasons. And then there's a whole host of statistical methods that can be used to massage the data a little bit.
sure. Oh, wow. So there's a study that is very often cited, 2002 Madsen et al.
Yeah.
It's cited to establish vaccine safety and to debunk the autism link. So can you break that study down for us? What does it actually say? And conflicts of interest and all of that
Yeah,
potential.
okay. This one examined the medical records of over 500,000 Danish children between 1991 and 1998.
Okay.
So it basically compared the rates of autism in children who received the MMR vaccine and those who didn't. And so
Mm-hmm.
the researchers found that the rates of autism in the two groups were almost identical.
Mm-hmm.
So sounds very
Makes sense.
straightforward, really
Right.
large group studied, had the vaccine or not, case
Right.
closed.
Right.
But then if you dig into the details. So
Sure.
yeah, so firstly, the conflicts of interest. So who carried out the study?
Right.
So on that particular one, there were 8 researchers.
Mm.
One of them actually worked for the US CDC, and the rest of them worked for this institution that kept receiving funding from the CDC, including for this particular study that they did. So the conflicts of interest were really clear. So just as a reminder, so the CDC is the one that sets the childhood vaccine schedule in the US, obviously. So they're under huge pressure to prove that the vaccine schedule is safe.
Mm.
Another fun fact on the study is that lead author is actually wanted for fraud to this day.
Oh,
He pocketed some of the funds from that had been funded for the study. But
oh,
anyway,
great.
so conflicts of interest is a big issue. But
Sure.
then
Yeah.
we get into the raw data.
Uh-huh.
So while it sounds like a really big giant study, 500,000 kids, the
Mm.
number actually diagnosed with autism was 253 in the MMR group and 53 in the group that was identified as non-MMR. So these are tiny numbers and
Uh,
really difficult to draw statistical conclusions from. And
sure.
it would only take a handful of children to be put in the wrong group to completely change what the conclusions were.
Right.
So, remember this is in the 1990s when children were only getting a handful of vaccines and much less autism than we see today.
Sure.
So, one of the critical pieces of this data, you might imagine, is, if you were diagnosed with autism or not, did you get the MMR vaccine or not? That's a really
Right.
critical piece of information.
Obviously, yeah.
So, did they study whether the records were correct? So, of those 53 children that were indicated as non-MMR, is it conceivable that maybe their physicians, when they saw there was a severe reaction, maybe they didn't complete the record completely, or maybe it was just an oversight? Who knows? But the authors admit that they made no follow-up at all. They just, whatever the database was, and it was only 53, it wouldn't have taken too
Taken
much work,
forever. Yeah,
or even
sure.
just to all of them, like 300.
Right.
No, there was no follow-up to really double check and interview anybody. Did they really get the vaccine? But
Uh-huh.
the biggest kicker in this study, and you can look at this yourself in the paper, if you look at the paper, there's a table in the paper that actually shows the raw data, and that the kids that got the shot were 45% more likely to have autism than the non-MMR group. But clearly an increased risk. Okay,
Right.
but the conclusions, if you then go down to the conclusions, they simply say, well, there's no, same risk or even lower risk,
Right.
in the shot group. And when you press the researchers, they just say, well, we had to make adjustments to the data for, like birth weight, gender, socioeconomic status, but they don't really go into any of the
How
details of
they've done it.
why they made these adjustments, or even why the adjustments completely reverse the conclusions that are shown by the raw data.
Yeah, how often does that happen? Where especially, and I assume the retrospective studies are where they can really do this.
Yeah.
How often do they, the raw data completely contradict what their conclusions are?
Yeah, a lot. So yeah, so that's just one study
Yeah.
of 5 examples that the book Turtles goes into in a lot of
Yeah.
detail. But unfortunately, there's probably a lot more studies out there that are like this. But
Sure.
the book looks at these 5 in particular because they're really examples of all the different ways that data can be
You get
manipulated. Because
manipulated.
if you're not
Yeah.
really statistical like me, a bit of a data geek, then you think, well, data is data, right? You,
All of
you can't
this.
manipulate
Sure.
data.
Yeah.
So, but then it also shows how the conclusions can then be manipulated to
Right.
drive, public understanding. So
Sure.
another of the widely quoted ones is another 2013 study that apparently addressed the argument that it's too many vaccines on the schedule that's created problems. But that study was actually completely funded and carried out by the CDC itself.
Oh, great.
And if you dig into it, it didn't even study the vaccines and the number of vaccines. It studied the number of antigens. So antigens are they're for the disease or the
Right.
virus.
Yeah.
And you can have a number of different antigens in different vaccines. So one vaccine by one manufacturer might have 3,000 antigens and another one has 5.
Mm.
So massive differences. So you can't really do a statistical analysis on the question of vaccines when you really just focus on the number of antigens. It really makes no sense. And
Yeah.
then you've got all those different ingredients like we mentioned.
Right.
Yet the media uses that particular one, not really understanding statistics, to
Right.
quote conclusions about the vaccines, not
Right.
when it
Yeah.
wasn't really even doing that. But
Mm.
one of the verse we've mentioned Gardasil already.
Right.
Another of the really bad studies was published in 2014, and it was about the Gardasil HPV vaccine, and it was all about autoimmune disease. So just to show you another manipulation. So this was actually funded by the pharmaceutical companies that makes Gardasil, right?
Oh,
So
great.
conflict of interest again. So they report that they compared a group of teenagers with autoimmune disease with a control group. And then they want to see whether those with autoimmune disease had more of the HPV vaccine or not. But then if you dig into the control group that was used, you
Right.
find that those kids were just as sick as the autoimmune kids. And so the
Oh,
sleight of hand that they use, so when you have a control group, the way it works, you have to make like a demographic match for each of the test
sure.
subjects.
Right.
So let's say you have a test subject with lupus. You
Right.
have to have a control kid of a
Right.
similar age and gender probably that doesn't have lupus, right?
Right.
But then
Right.
you found when you dig into it, they could have type 1 diabetes or
Sure.
rheumatoid arthritis.
Some other
And so
chronic
the
disease.
control kids
Yeah.
were just as sick. So
Oh,
again, the media just picks up, this is
sound
what the
bites.
study concluded without
Sure.
digging into the details.
Oh my goodness. So all of this does kind of scream the question of motive. So why would health authorities and vaccine manufacturers and scientists and medical journals all collude to publish misleading data? What's going
Yeah.
on?
Yeah. Well, you have to break it down a little bit,
Yeah.
to
Okay.
understand. So firstly, it starts in with the manufacturers. Well, they're
Right.
just focused on making a profit, right? So they've developed a
Sure.
product and they want to sell as many as possible. Big pharma is the most profitable industry in the world, and they wield a lot of power to make sure that they stay that way.
Yeah.
And then you got the health authorities, and so they've been recommending and sometimes mandating vaccines all of these past decades, and so they want to protect themselves against liability.
Mhm.
Because if people acknowledge that vaccines can cause health problems,
Mhm.
then people that have been injured in the past are going to come looking for
Sure. Yeah.
compensation.
Right.
And then you got the scientists and medical journals. Well, they're not the totally independent, objective, truth-seeking, individuals that we like to assume that they are. The book explains this as the pure science myth.
Mm.
So scientists are human like any of us. They've got to put food on the table for their families,
Mm.
and just the way that they get funding for their research, usually that comes from big pharma or governance, the people with the deepest pockets. And if they publish a study that is unfavorable to those entities, then they're not going to get funding for their work, in the future. And
Yeah.
then another part of the myth is the peer review process
Mm.
that the medical journals are supposed to have. And again, we like to think that this is totally objective, right? But the reviewers are often handpicked. They don't get paid for their review. So they have to basically do it in their spare time. Most of the time, they don't get access to the raw data that the study was based on.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, and it's very rare that a reviewer will have any problems with it. The British Medical Journal actually did a study. They tested, they planted some studies for review that had some very obvious errors to see
Uh-huh.
how many of those errors were picked up by their reviewers,
Uh-huh.
and most of them were not. Pretty scary. So it's not necessarily that it's one big conspiracy. It's
There's
just
a
that
lot of
the
different motives.
individuals and,
Yeah.
and the entities involved just really are acting within their own best interests.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. And also the whole idea of who wants to admit they've been wrong,
Right.
like after all that time. So, are there any studies out there that already that currently exist that will demonstrate any correlation, even not causation, but correlation between the childhood vaccines and the increasing childhood morbidity in terms of chronic disease?
Yeah. Well, we first have to start with, what would this require?
Sure.
So it should seem obvious that we should be comparing the health of vaccinated children
Right,
and adults with
right,
those who were never vaccinated, or at
right.
least had fewer than the
Sure.
schedule, right? So authorities, i.e. the governments, have never published such a study. Even there was an investigative journalist in 2005 that noticed that the rates of autism in the Amish community were a fraction of the general population, and he speculated it was mostly because they don't vaccinate, tend not to vaccinate. And you think the government would jump at this discovery and, oh, let's
Perfect. Yeah,
investigate further, but
yeah,
nothing at all. There
sure.
was an academic study done in Israel in 2004 that noticed the autism rate was basically zero in the Ethiopian immigrants. In the 1990s, there was a huge number of Ethiopians. They found these Jewish Ethiopians, and
Mhm.
they emigrated to Israel. And so they hadn't been vaccinated as children at all in Ethiopia, and then now they were subject to the same diagnostic conditions in Israel. Again, should have dug into that a little bit more, but total silence.
Mhm.
So the fact that the Institute of Medicine paper from 2013, it stated quite openly that there's no research comparing vaccinated to unvaccinated
Yeah,
health outcomes, but that paper just made excuses as to why. So ranging from it's unethical. So
right,
to assign some children to take a vaccine and others just to get the saline
right.
placebo shot or something. But if you think about it, that's a circular argument, right? Because it's assuming that they're safe and effective, and therefore, we shouldn't withhold this from children.
Right, right.
They say it's too expensive, and there aren't enough
Mhm.
voluntarily unvaccinated children. Neither of those arguments are true. The VSD, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, clearly has, I think it's over 1% of children are unvaccinated. So you could do a study there. They
That's
say that, such a study will be biased
mhm.
because parents who don't vaccinate are going to have unusually healthy children due to their lifestyle. Well, again, that's kind of a bit of a circular argument,
Uh-huh.
right?
Sure,
Anyway, but even so, all of those issues could be solved. And,
sure.
and in fact, some robust studies have been done, outside of the establishment by ethical individual scientists who've risked their careers and continue to do so. Probably there are some government studies that have been done quietly, but they were never published because they didn't like the results.
Sure.
But there's a great book published earlier this year by Children's Health Defense. Again, it's published by Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
and Dr. Brian Hooker, and it's called Vax Unvax, Let the Science Speak.
Mm.
It's also in the further reading section of my book.
Yeah.
It's a compendium of about 100 studies
Mhm.
that in various ways are looking at health outcomes in vaxxed versus unvaxxed populations. And
Mhm.
it's a great book. It's, layman's language, really great, colorful graphs, really, kind of small, but easy to read.
Mhm.
And so there's one of the more high profile studies that I think that book covers was carried out by a pediatrician in Oregon, Dr. Paul Thomas. You
Mhm.
might have heard of him. This was a big media storm, actually, because it kind of came out just when kind of COVID was
Oh,
hitting and things
yeah.
like that. So it made a big media stink. He had a very large pediatric practice in Oregon, I think 10,000 kids.
Mhm.
And he would give his parents the option to vaccinate or not. He'd educate them on each individual vaccine, what it did, what it was protecting against, what the risks were, and he'd let his parents choose. So he had a big range of completely fully vaccinated based on the US schedule, middle, something in the middle, and then some parents didn't vaccinate at all. And he noticed that his unvaccinated kids never came to his clinic except for their annual well checks. And he's
Right.
like, there's something going on here. I want to investigate. So he reached out to a data scientist, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, and gave him anonymized data, completely anonymized. And Dr. Lyons-Weiler was very skeptical. He'd fully vaccinated all his kids. He's like, I don't think we're going to find anything. And he did.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, he looked at it, and the data was unbelievable. I remember when it came out in 2020, it blew my mind, and I knew a lot of this stuff, but
Sure.
it was so blatant that the levels of asthma, autism, type 2 diabetes, eczema, you name it, Crohn's disease, everything was so much lower in the unvaccinated or partially vaccinated kids than in the vaccinated. It was crazy, and the medical establishment went after Dr. Thomas, similar to Dr. Wakefield.
Yeah.
But again, now God works well, because now he's got this great podcast, and he advises people through that. And he's written some books and things like that. So yes, there are some studies, but you won't find them in mainstream media.
Wow. So one of probably the most common arguments in favor of vaccinating is the idea that it's thanks to vaccines that chronic disease has disappeared across the globe to a large extent. So is that an oversimplification? Is there more to that story?
Yes, there's more to the story. So yeah, if we dig into the data on mortality from infectious disease, we can see that it was totally plummeting already in the first half of the 20th century,
Okay.
before vaccines and even antibiotics came on the scene.
Yeah.
So it's not hidden data. It's readily available. I've got several graphs in my book,
Yeah.
even studies by CDC doctors in the 1970s and preeminent scientists at Johns Hopkins Medical School. They've confirmed that infectious disease had dropped by 90% by the 1940s,
Mhm.
and therefore
Wow.
vaccination can't account for the health improvements.
Yeah. And so what were some of the reasons why the infectious disease had dropped so dramatically before vaccines even came on the scene?
So the biggest improvements were in sanitation,
Yeah.
clean water,
Right.
better nutrition. So once people had moved to the cities, the living conditions were really terrible, right? And so getting hold of fresh fruits and vegetables became problematic. But then refrigeration was developed, and people had ice boxes in their home to keep food fresh. You could transport those fruits and vegetables longer distances. Now they had refrigeration and ice boxes. And another big change was the removal of horses. Simple.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
used to be the main mode of transport, right? They're defecating everywhere and spreading disease.
Right.
Yeah, so
Nobody
yeah.
thinks about that, but
and
yeah.
then and personal hygiene, just general personal hygiene, improved through an understanding of microbes, washing of hands, washing your clothes really well in hot water. Another great book that I recommend in mine. I've got a very extensive further reading section,
Yeah.
but Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Suzanne Humphreys. She's also got a great website of the same name, but her book is chock full of images and newspapers and photos of the time. It's a really thick book, and it showed what living conditions were really like. Because a lot of people nowadays they have no idea. A lot of people aren't even studying some of the history, and history is
Right.
getting rewritten sometimes. But it really shows that absolutely doctors and scientists contributed to the massive reduction in disease, but it was through an understanding of what causes disease and some of these elements of hygiene and sanitation where disease comes from, rather than the vaccines which came later.
Right. And so there were other infectious diseases that did not correspond to a vaccine that dropped as well during that time, right? And
Yeah,
also
yeah.
afterwards. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the establishment likes to focus on the reduction in the vaccine preventable
Sure.
diseases these days, but what they don't highlight is the concurrent reduction in lots of diseases that didn't have any vaccines. So you got like dysentery, cholera,
Mhm.
scarlet fever, typhoid, and then you've got the diseases that weren't due to microbes at all. So scurvy, beriberi, pellagra. These were due to nutrient deficiencies. So, these are fatal illnesses too, but at the
Right.
same time, it highlights the drop in them. And again, I've got data in my book, but the drop highlights that the improved nutrition was really helping a body be able to fight a bug,
Right.
as well as avoiding those nutrient deficiencies.
Yeah, yeah. And that's just to be like fair and balanced. That's not to say that vaccines had no effect on dropping any infectious disease levels, right? And antibiotics and all the rest of it. Sure.
Well, it's complicated,
Yeah.
right? So,
Okay.
so I'm a statistician, and statistics can't fully confirm or deny that
Right.
there's just too many variables.
Yeah.
But was there any benefit to vaccines at all? It would depend on the vaccine and depend on what benefit you're focused on. Is
Right.
the reduction in a particular infectious disease circulating in the population? Is there a benefit to reducing that? Possibly.
Mhm.
Did antibiotics wipe out a chronic infection that somebody who's malnourished and can't fight on their own might otherwise have died? Yes, of course. But the potential benefit for the population as a whole doesn't necessarily translate into the benefit for any given individual. There's a lot more going on.
Okay, and so that leads into the whole concept of herd immunity, which we heard a lot about 4 years ago. So, first of all, what is it? And like, does it eventually eradicate a disease? Because that's, I think, what everybody thinks, that if you can get to a certain threshold of herd immunity, then that disease is effectively gone.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, let's first explain what we mean by immunity, right? So, there's
Yeah,
actually two levels of immunity.
right.
So, you get immune from getting sick and
Mhm.
then immune from getting infected.
Okay.
So, these are two very different propositions, and it's
Right.
important to understand the difference. So, if say the flu is circulating, you could be infected with the virus and you don't actually feel any symptoms. You might be referred to as immune to the virus. You're not getting sick. You
Mhm.
go on with your life, but actually you're a carrier and you're passing it on to others.
Right.
Or you might not get infected at all and then you can't pass it on to others. So both of these situations are referred to as immunity.
Mhm.
So herd immunity says that if you have enough people in a given population who have the second type of immunity, so
Mhm.
they don't get infected and therefore they can't pass it on, and then the chain of transmission is broken, and in theory, the disease will disappear.
Mhm. And so, do vaccines confer that second type of immunity?
Well, so the whole concept of mandatory vaccination, right, is based on the
On
on the
that.
concept of herd immunity. As you say, that's what
Right.
we heard during COVID. But even if you prefer not to get a vaccine yourself, you're compelled to because of the wider good. But the
Sure.
problem is that most of the vaccines don't provide herd immunity. So if we take a couple of examples, so firstly, tetanus.
Mhm.
Okay, so tetanus is a disease that's created by a toxin that's
Right.
excreted from a bacteria that lives in soil and feces, and you can pick it up from an infected wound.
Right.
Very common when those horses were around. But humans don't excrete the bacteria, so they can't pass it on to anybody. So herd immunity makes absolutely no sense with tetanus.
Mhm.
Pertussis. Let's look at pertussis. So that's probably the most telling example of where the medical community is a little bit deceptive on this point. So whooping cough. Pertussis is whooping cough, and
Mhm.
that's from the bacteria Bordetella pertussis. It can be very nasty, particularly in the young. The vaccine for it is usually administered part of that DTaP vaccine that we mentioned earlier. It's been around for decades and it's administered at 2, 4, and 6 months, and I think with later boosters. So, but the problem is there's tons of whooping cough around.
Right.
You might not get the massive big hoop that the reason it got that whoop, I think they call it here. So the where it gets its name from, it might just be like a bit of a flu or a cold, but there's
Sure.
tons of whooping cough around. You just
Right.
don't hear that in the media, right?
Yeah.
So the researchers kind of said, yeah, why is there so much whooping cough still around? So they
Okay.
decided to investigate it in 2014, and
Okay.
so they ran this big experiment with baboons
Uh-huh.
who exhibit whooping cough very similar to humans. And
Sure.
so they had a group that had been vaccinated,
Mhm.
a group that they had the natural disease, they just caught whooping cough and they'd recovered, and then a group that had neither had the vaccine nor got it naturally. And then they just monitored. They tested various combinations, putting in cages and looking to see what happens, tested the levels of antibodies in their body, all of that.
Mhm.
And so the experiment basically showed that vaccinated individuals, they didn't get sick, but they
Mhm.
still had the bacteria in their respiratory tract for 30 days and could easily pass it on to others. Now, if you
Sure.
got the naturally infected and recovered, they never got infected again, and they never passed it on to anybody. They kept repeating the experiment. They repeated it with mice, the same results. And
Right.
even some of those human epidemiological studies have showed that infection doesn't actually fall in a population when the vaccine has been rolled out.
Huh.
So, that's one that's particularly concerning. But there are some that do
Right.
confirm some level of herd immunity. So hepatitis A is one, for example. But if you look at it, this disease has almost zero mortality.
Mhm.
90% of people that get infected, don't even get sick. You could get it as a kid, and then you'd never get it again, and you wouldn't even, know that you had it. But if you get it as an adult, after the vaccine is worn off, it could actually cause chronic problems in your liver, right?
Mhm.
And similarly for hepatitis B, possibly that vaccine creates herd immunity. There is some evidence of that.
Mhm.
And so you're not going to get infected. But 99% of children, it's totally irrelevant, as hepatitis B is only passed through sexual contact with a carrier or blood and blood products. And so, yeah, if you're a healthcare worker later in life, that might make sense to do that.
Right.
Or, by the way, hepatitis has been shown to be passed through contaminated needles. And there's a lot of evidence through actually vaccination campaigns, especially in the
Oh,
third world, and they end up
oh
passing
my.
on hepatitis B. So, it's, yes, some of them do provide herd immunity, but, for the vaccines that sort of make no sense, and you don't really need them anyway.
Sure.
But then there are even other complications. So if we look at pneumococcal,
Uh-huh.
so pneumococcal is a bacteria that has 90 serotypes.
Right.
And some of them cause more serious disease than others. So you might just get an ear infection or some sniffles compared to invasive meningitis, right?
Mhm.
So the first vaccine was called Prevnar, and it seemed to confer some herd immunity, but only to the strains included. I
Uh-huh.
think that one was maybe 7 strains. And so very quickly they developed a new one, and they call that now Prevnar 13, which
Mhm.
covered more strains.
Right.
But out of 90, there's still many strains out there. And
Yeah.
so they've removed some of the strains that have maybe gone extinct, but has
Right.
it caused more virulence in some of the
Right.
strains that are left, right?
Uh-huh.
So the Turtles book does a really great job of summarizing what do we know of the evidence for herd immunity in each of the different vaccines on the
Mhm.
schedule, and then it tabulates it all really clearly, and it shows about a third
Mhm.
probably confer herd immunity. That's, I think, 5 out of 14,
Mhm.
but the rest don't.
Right. Fascinating. So, and kind of piggybacking on what you just said about the pneumococcal, um, I'd always kind of wondered, based on shingles, especially, that I mean, that one is, I get asked about that all the time. And when I was in school, we were taught that this really only, people only get shingles if you're elderly or immunocompromised.
Right.
And that's definitely not true anymore. People are
Right.
young and healthy, and it's just all over the place.
Yeah.
So I'd always kind of speculated, is this because of the prevalence of the vaccine? Because that's what we see with antibiotic resistance, right? Like a certain antibiotic works great, but then if you overuse it, now the bacteria mutates. And
Yeah.
you kind of alluded to the fact that at least we know that some viruses are doing this too.
Yeah.
So what kind of evidence do we have of this? Is that even a
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So,
Yeah,
so chickenpox is a really good example of when mass vaccination is actually leading to worse
right,
disease. So,
right,
chickenpox is always a mild virus, usually contracted in childhood. I got it in the UK when I was 7 or 8, missed a week
sure,
of school, all good.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it was great. A bad outcome is extremely rare. I think it's like one in 100,000. Even have any problems at all.
Mhm.
But Merck introduced their varicella vaccine, and the US requires it in children. I think 1 year old they have to get, and I think they get a booster, a few years later.
Mhm.
It does reduce the incidence of chickenpox in children. It does do that, but the evidence is that the effects wear off after 10 or 20 years, even leaving vulnerable adults. In the UK and actually most other Western countries, they analysed and they don't recommend varicella. They say the benefits don't outweigh the harms and the cost of administering it. So it's really kind of a US phenomenon. But in adults, varicella is far more virulent, as you said. So it'll show up as pneumonia-like symptoms and shingles. And
Mhm.
shingles can be really debilitating, and a lot of pain, even blindness. That can be really a problem. But when you leave it to Mother Nature, when children contract chickenpox naturally, they're then immune for life. And then when you've got the natural virus circulating amongst all these school age kids that are getting it and recovering, it actually seems to boost the natural immunity in adults, in older people. But
Yeah.
since the vaccine has come out and now you're eliminating it in the children,
Mhm.
now there's no natural boosting going on in the adult population, and now you're seeing a lot more shingles.
Interesting. And so for things like the flu shots, where, it mutates every year, why do we have some where you need constant boosters like yearly, and now they're doing it for COVID as well, versus others where it's one and done, although occasionally there's boosters down the line from a developmental standpoint. Why is there a difference in terms of certain organisms versus others?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no evidence that any vaccine will grant immunity for life.
Mm.
The complexity of the human body means we don't really fully understand everything. So
Yeah.
when you get, infected by a bacteria or a virus, there's so many things going on in the body, right? So delving into the science really makes it clear that a natural infection is going to give you immunity for life for the most part, and a lot more robust immunity,
Right.
basically. But some vaccines do seem to confer more or longer lasting immunity than others. There is a difference. And flu, as you mentioned, that's a particularly poor one. It's worth looking at that because people are still getting flu shots everywhere. It's really bad news, and now they're going to do the same thing for COVID. So the influenza virus is constantly mutating, right?
Mm.
So every year there's a different strain or strains circulating in the population. The authorities don't even pretend that it's going to stop you getting the flu. They
Right.
just say it's going to reduce the severity of the illness that you're going to get.
Mm.
But they have to guess the strains that are going to come out 6 months later,
Right.
because of the manufacturing process. And so they say, oh, for the next season, it's going to be these. So that's what we'll manufacture. And often they get it really, really wrong. And the efficacy is well below half, even 30% sometimes. And then you're getting a shot that is not really protecting you against the right strains. And you're getting all of those other ingredients that we mentioned. So you're getting this insult to your very complex immune system. We call all these different kinds of shots vaccines, but the fact is they all work really differently in the body, and the illnesses that they're trying to alleviate or stop you getting really come from many different kinds of creatures. So viruses, bacteria, even the illnesses from something the bacteria is excreting,
Mm.
and even parasites that, malaria comes from parasites essentially. And so, all of these differences are working in very different ways in the body, and sometimes the scientists themselves don't even know how they work. So I always say, if you're being a really discerning consumer of healthcare, that's what I try and teach people to be. You need to look at each vaccine on its own merit. So you compare the risk of the disease itself with your individual circumstances, and send the benefits of the shot, the mechanism of action of the shot, some of the risks of the shot.
Yeah.
There are independent sources out there that you can get more information.
Mm.
The National Vaccine Information Center, nvic.org, is a
Mm.
really good independent source.
Mhm. So taking a step back and kind of looking at population level in terms of like progression of chronic disease in kids since the vaccine schedule has kind of blown up,
Yeah,
as you mentioned, since the late 80s, early
yeah,
90s. So what are some of the statistics? I mean, this is correlation, not causation, because people
right,
haven't, at least as
right,
far as I know, haven't
right.
looked in a granular way to say, is there an association? But why are we particularly concerned about the progression? What's going on?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we start back, one of the first surveys, full broad national surveys that was carried out is back in the 1960s. And at that time, 1.8% of children was found to have some sort of chronic condition, a vision or hearing problems, even asthma, mental health problems, things like that. So 1.8%. Then the next survey was like 1981. And by then it was already 3.8% of children had something like that. So it had already started to double. The 1994 survey, it said 6.4% of children, and by 2010, it was 8% of children. So
Wow.
now we see data that says one of every 12 children in the US is disabled due to some sort of chronic illness. There's different kinds of surveys. So there's a different one in 2008 that took a sample of 90,000 children. It was a much more detailed survey. So it got into a lot of different aspects. And it found that 43% of children, that's nearly half, had some sort of chronic condition, and half of those they indicated it was moderate to severe. And then there's surveys of individual conditions, and you can look at these over the decades. So the rise of asthma, ADHD, autism, allergies, epilepsy, autoimmune conditions we've talked about, they've all completely skyrocketed over the last 30 years, since the massive expansion. But then you can also look at medication data. So the big pharmacy, the big pharmacy companies, not the pharmaceutical companies, the pharmaceutical management companies that get you your prescriptions and they deliver those to you mail order. They've got a lot of fantastic data, and they show a massive rise in the number of children and adults that are taking medication, but particularly children. I mean, we've normalized ill health in our children. Children used to be healthy, and now that kind of data shows that 1 in 4 American children take regular medication for a chronic condition. They're similar in other countries, but it's really, really bad in the US, just the way we love our medications. And then you can look at a survey of hospitalizations and people getting hospitalized, particularly children under the age of 4, getting hospitalized, and again that's completely skyrocketed. So it sounds like we've traded the occasional infectious disease. You're sick for a week and then it confers lifelong immunity, and actually we can also see it strengthens the immune system. There's a lot of data that shows it's strengthening the immune system, and just to listeners, our immune system is also protecting us against things like cancer and managing the inflammation in our bodies and other things that are going on in our bodies. So our immune system is absolutely critical, and so we've traded this 1 week of having some sniffles or not feeling well in bed to the normalization of chronic disease and total reliance on pharmaceutical medications.
Yeah, that's crazy. And at the same time, we also have had like a massive explosion in all of the pesticides and all of the additives in our foods, and just the world is getting increasingly toxic in a number of ways. But there's certainly a interesting correlation here as well.
Yeah.
So, what have I not asked you that you want to make sure you leave with our audience?
Maybe 2 things. I mean, you mentioned the name of the book, which I think is awesome, and so the one reason is that all of the science is turtles all the way down. But the other reason it's called that, which is so clever, is that scientists used to use that story to show that the old lady is kind of a layperson, and oh shucks, she's a layperson, she doesn't know what she's talking about, and the scientist has got all this data. Well, they've also used it to show the roles are actually reversed. That it's the parents and the lay people that are making these very rational assertions based on very clear evidence and data, and it's the scientists that are actually being a little unreasonable. So I did want to mention that. But then I think I just really want to leave the audience on a positive, because we talked about a lot of negatives here, and so if there's all these problems with vaccines, then what are we going to do about infectious disease, right? So it's a whole separate discussion, but I do have a whole chapter in my book that really covers this, and I explain all the different elements of the wonderful immune system and how it works perfectly the way it's been designed to keep you healthy, and just it'll give you a broad understanding of how to stay healthy through more natural means. And I actually refer to the end of flu season. You don't have to participate once you understand what really generates health, right? And all these natural remedies can work in conjunction with your body to keep you strong. So don't want to live on a negative note. I want to live on a really positive note, that there's other things you can do, and you don't need these vaccines.
Right. And our bodies are designed to heal themselves. God knew what he was doing. So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
So I will link in the show notes to your book and to Turtles All the Way Down for our listeners. And thank you, Emma. This has been wonderful, and I think a really important conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.